This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for coming to week 2 of our Golf Symposium webinar series in conjunction with the GCSA NY. Suzanne Miss has been instrumental in helping us organize this. Today we've got Dr. Doug Soldat from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We're going to talk today about optimizing nitrogen. So before we do that, we'll just thank our sponsors really quick, people who are helping us put this together. So the platinum sponsors, Andre and Son, First Turf and Ornamental, Grassland, Harrell's. We've got gold sponsors, Finch Turf, BASF, Pump Irrigation Technologies, and MTE. And then our silver sponsors here too, Syngenta, Ewing, Nutrient Solutions, Turf and Soil, Dryject, and Weaver Golf Turf Solutions. So the next order of business, GCSA education points. So again, if you can get to this screen, there's a submit your points section. And then on the screen now for our live viewers, you'll see an approval code here. And don't worry about jotting this down real quick. I'll throw this in the chat box too, so you'll have that to enter in after. And then for anybody arriving late, I'll throw that again in the chat box later on. So first we'll have a quick presentation from Frank. Frank Rossi is going to give us a quick update on the growing season here in the Northeast, and then we'll get right to Doug and talking about optimizing nitrogen.
How about this guy? Some golf superintendent posted this picture, and again, I was scouring. I couldn't remember where I grabbed it from, but he was the spitting image of his old man. And so we're happy to have you for week 6 here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing this because I want to hear what Doug has to say too. Shout out to all the crews out there. Plant Food, supporting them with masks, learning to work safe. I'd like to see a little more separation among you guys, actually, but we are really hoping for your safety while you're out there doing the work. You know, you look for things all the time, and how do I want to talk about what we're going through and teaching about it without being distracting? And just to remind everybody, you know, the NGF has got a section now that they've devoted to this around COVID, and they're starting to measure, you know, it's a consumer, it's the business of golf, right? And how much are people itchy for this and how anxious are they? And for those of us in the I-95 corridor here, you would say they're itching to the point of starting to bleed. The anxiety is pretty high, and the itch meter is pretty high as well. So, you know, obviously our golfers want to get back, but when you think about our golfers, you have to understand something. A lot of the people who we serve the most, you know, 90% of the rounds are played by these core golfers who play at least 8 rounds. I mean, I know a lot of people play 6 and 7 or 8. So core golfers, they're ready to get playing. And so how are we open? Pretty wide open across the United States, 45 states, and Pennsylvania, I think, just said they were opening yesterday. You look in the Northeast, and we have by far the predominance of closed orders, at least as of the 26th. Some of these things can change pretty dramatically. A colleague of ours who used to work at the University of Minnesota started a company called greenergolf.com, Greener Golf. And Parker Anderson and Parker Cohn are involved with this. And, you know, this is the beginning of how we as an industry begin to move through this situation. You know, this is a business that we have to run, or at least are able to run. We want to run it safely. And it's very much an experience, right? I mean, obviously this whole thing is dampening the sort of experience to a certain extent, but how do we help our golfers make their way through this process? And, you know, this may not necessarily involve golf course superintendents. I personally think in some ways it should, obviously, because they're spending a lot of time on the golf course. And the Parkers and Greener Golf have put together this roadmap. You can find it on their website. There's cards, there's information. I contributed to some course conditioning things that they put on there. If you're not open, if you are open. And so things change rapidly. Again, just suggestions for the way to start to operate safely as we begin to approach this. The phased approach to opening. And of course, New York State, you know, now Cuomo's talking about us reopening. So obviously, these are the kinds of things we have to keep in our mind. And obviously part of that is keeping our crew safe. So, you just can't help if, when you're sitting around looking for things. How many golf superintendents are, doing some of these sorts of things? Big shout out to the golf superintendents with their kids at the properties and, of course, a dog nearby. So this is the new normal, right? Fivesomes with 5 carts. And what does that mean for us? Well, from a growth perspective, let's start to talk about growing grass. This is what we looked at like about 3 weeks ago in the soil. About 3 weeks ago, it looked like we were starting to creep into the low to mid 50s in the New York metropolitan area, still fairly cool, much to the north. Well, here we are 3 weeks later, and we've barely advanced much in this soil temperature regime, right? So look at how far behind we are now in some cases, 3 weeks throughout much of upstate New York, right around normal. Now, the forecast is calling for, average temperatures regularly in the 50s. We're going to slowly start to emerge from what looked like, as I wrote about in Shortcut this week, suspended animation of the growing season. Now, that has resulted, as we've talked about week after week, I'm not sure I've changed this slide at all in the last 4 weeks, because we've been struggling in many places to get the average temperatures across the Northeast in the 50s. And so, what did I do? I looked back at my colleague's, one of his old presentations on nutrients, and I find a slide he puts in there. Doug, is so well trained, right? Coming from Cornell. And so I look at this like, oh, guess what? I've been talking about growth potential, and it really doesn't relate to the actual growth that's sometimes measured. And I'm sure Doug is going to address that as we talk about this moving forward. And I can help but think he's also going to talk about his mentor, an early mentor of mine, Wayne Cuso, who talked a lot about in his early career about how responsive turf grasses are to nitrogen. Now, why is this all really important and pertinent? Well, remember what we said the new normal was and what this is going to result in. And so I'm sure how we're managing our nutrients, particularly nitrogen, with this kind of traffic. This could even mean, lower rounds, but more traffic. One wouldn't think it. And so with that, Doug and Carl, that's all I have to say today in my introduction, and just see if there's any questions on anything I talked about. And if not, Doug, I'll pass it right off to you and see if I set you up on the tee okay with that commentary. I've been barking about growth potential, and then I'm fishing around. I'm thinking, what has Doug said about this in the past? And oh, well, guess what? It doesn't seem to correlate. And I know there's a story behind that you're probably going to tell us a little bit about today.
Yeah, perfect. Couldn't have set me up better.
All right.
As I expected.
I had one
Yeah.
job.
Okay. I'll go into screen share here. You see it?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And look what I found.
Oh, good.
There it is, the ribbon cutting here, 1992. So, all right. We've been doing a lot of work on growth, and the reason I care so much about growth, and Frank and I talked about this when I was a student at Cornell, is like it matters, but nobody measures it, right? Wayne Cuso, the guy I worked for, I was collecting clippings all the time. I thought that was normal, and then when I get out and start reading what other people are doing, not too many people collect clippings. They just give it a quality rating, and it's like, we're not trying to maximize yield, but it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And so I think Michael Woods in his book Short Grammar of Greenkeeping says it really nice. Like, the goal of greenkeeping is to grow grass at the slowest rate possible. So you got to have some growth to recover from the damage, but in general you just want to have the slowest growth rate possible. So why don't you measure that? And the reason I haven't been promoting measuring it until this late in my career here, 14 years later, is because it's super hard. And I didn't see the correlation between the clipping volume and the clipping mass. So we measure clipping mass, which takes a lot of labor, but volume is a really good approximation of it. So with that that advance in our understanding, I'm going to show you ways that you can use that to optimize your nitrogen. Okay, so I got to start out with this presentation here, the Liebig's law of the minimum. It's a thing we teach in our introductory soils class, soil fertility, turf grass fertility. You don't take a class at the university without hearing about this law. And it's not perfect. I can poke holes in this thing, but it's pretty darn good. And in this case, we're looking at a barrel that we're in Wisconsin, so the amount of beer in this barrel is limited by this shortest stave here. Okay, and in this case, it's phosphorus. So you're not going to get any more beer in this barrel unless you add phosphorus and increase the length of that stave, at which point you're going to become limited by the next most limiting thing, which is nitrogen. So Liebig, this Justice von Liebig fellow, figured this out, in the 1800s, and it's a pretty right. Okay, and so the reason that I'll roll my eyes when I see these tank mixes going out with 17 different nutrients in them is because really the grass only needs one of those things at any given time. You're not going to be with very, very rare circumstances are you going to be limited by more than one nutrient at the same time. And in our case, we're B almost all the time. So sure, in the next slide, I'm going to show you a picture of what A looks like, but most superintendents are sitting here at B, where your grass growth rate is being controlled by nitrogen. Now, right now, it's probably being controlled by other things that aren't nutrients, like heat. Frank was just showing us the growing degree days. So we need more heat to get that situation rectified. So here's situation A. This grass growth is limited by phosphorus. And put all the nitrogen, all the calcium in the world, all the potassium down on this, and it's not going to make this grass grow. It's limited by phosphorus. Add phosphorus, it's going to grow like crazy. So nitrogen won't make this grow, but phosphorus, on the other hand, is not going to make this one grow. This doesn't have a phosphorus deficiency. It is absolutely limited by nitrogen. So Liebig's law of the minimum is a really good place to start. You care about grass growth rate. The color and the quality and the performance and the disease, all that matters, but mostly the thing that matters is the growth rate. Get the growth rate right and all that other stuff will follow. So Frank showed a prettier version of this slide that my predecessor Wayne Cousseau developed, and this is Kentucky bluegrass, but look at the amount of clippings he's getting related to the nitrogen rate. So he didn't see the clipping production start to pull back until he was putting down a pound a week of nitrogen. Of course, we're down here in the 0 to 4, 0 to 5 range. So the grass is almost always starved for nitrogen. And so that's the case we're at. Nitrogen controls growth. Okay, so if you measure your growth, you're basically measuring your nitrogen. And so that's what I'm going to walk you through now. So the other thing you've got to keep in mind is nitrogen lives in the soil. Probably half or more of the nitrogen that you get in your plant is coming from your soil, and your fertilizer program is just supplementing the rest of it, and it's usually less than half. So it lives in these complex forms in basically organic matter. 99% of the nitrogen in the soil is in organic matter, and microbes are breaking it down and making it available. So the availability is difficult to predict because it's governed by how those when the microbes are working, which is usually when temperatures are warm and moisture conditions are good. But the reason it's so tightly linked to growth is because of this molecule here, this gray, blue, and red blob. This is a protein called rubisco. And rubisco, nitrogen is a big component of proteins. Proteins are built out of amino acids, and amine is the kind of a word that signifies nitrogen. So anytime you get a protein, it's loaded with nitrogen. And with the plant, this protein grabs carbon dioxide from the air and transforms it into sugar. And the more nitrogen you add, the more rubisco the plant makes, which is the more sugar the plant can make and the more the plant can grow. So you're literally just, when you're adding nitrogen, you're giving the plant more sugar. So it's a perfect analogy for plant food. You're feeding the plant with nitrogen. So another slide from Dr. Cousseau here. He was doing a fertilizer trial out at a local golf course in Madison. You see different rates, different timings, different sources. You get these different colors. These are all nitrogen deficient, meaning more nitrogen is going to make them all more green. But really, how do you pick? Do you pick on color? Do you pick on growth rate? What's the right choice? So for a long time we say, oh, it's an art. It's an art form. But just like soil water, our job is to make it less of an art form. And so I think we're getting there with the ability to measure and track and record growth rate rather than kind of the subjective feel for things. Okay, so nitrogen drives growth in almost all situations. Your job is to find that ideal growth rate and achieve it using nitrogen and plant growth regulators. I think in this webinar series for the last several weeks now, we've been thinking about growth because of COVID. Like, why are you putting down nitrogen and primo at the same time, right? I can think of reasons that might make sense, but I can think of a lot of reasons where you're just working against yourself. Are you trying to reduce growth? You're trying to increase it? Those two things do opposite things. But our growth is also affected by all this different stuff. The weather is huge, as you all know. Soil properties make a big difference. The soil moisture matters, traffic and wear, and there's probably others on this list. So growth is affected by all kinds of different things. You just got a couple tools that you can use to push it in one direction or the other. So you want to make sure that you understand where the growth is at naturally and what you should be doing to bump it back. A couple of years ago, we did a traffic evaluation on some lawn type grasses, and looking at which of these, tall fescue, fine fescue, a couple of different Kentucky bluegrasses performed best under traffic or no traffic. And one of the things we always do is collect clippings. And so this is the average clippings produced per month. So the scale goes from 0 to 100 for these 5 different grasses that we tested. And notice this isn't the main point here, but the more frequently you mow, the less clipping yield you get. So the blue bars are the yields when we mowed every week. And then you can see the yield shoots up when you mow every 2 weeks or every month. And that's because you're scalping and it produces a hormonal response. So follow that 1/3 rule, you're going to get less clippings. But this is the exact same scale, just this is no traffic, and that's with traffic. No traffic, with traffic. So let's look at a couple bluegrasses, HGT and turf blue. They look like they yield about the same under no traffic, but when we go to traffic, you can see the HGT is basically double. So that looks like a more traffic tolerant bluegrass to me. But the goal here is, we want to achieve probably some uniform growth rate, and maybe that, let's say it's 50. So maybe HGT here is hitting good growth under no traffic. We don't want to add nitrogen to this situation, but we start to throw traffic on it and our growth drops down to 25. We're going to have to increase our nitrogen rate to get this growth up to 50. Where we can, assuming that 50 is the growth rate that we want, right? You got to figure out what your levels are. We'll talk about that in a bit. But that's the whole concept here, is that by monitoring your growth, you can figure out what you need to do to manage that turf to hit those targets. So we've been doing with my PhD student, Chiyo Zhou, just a phenomenal student. She's been doing a lot of hard work looking at the factors that make creeping bentgrass greens grow: soil organic matter differences, amount of traffic, nitrogen, weather, and on and on and on. And in using that data to build growth models. So Frank talked about the pace turf growth model. Basically uses temperatures. So I use this in my class. It is a useful model because it tells people that temperature is one of the most important factors for turfgrass growth. So you may be seeing on Twitter people with these avatars that kind of show whatever their location is. These are 4 locations in California, and the blue is the cool season growth potential, and the red is the warm season growth potential. So you go down to Riverside, California, you got these spring and fall peaks where your cool season grasses are real happy. Summer hits and the growth potential drops off, but the warm season peaks, right? You go up to the Olympic Valley and you're basically just cool season growth, warm season growth potential 0. So it's a really, really cool, simplistic model that shows you the basics of the temperature stave on that limiting factor. The Liebig's law of the minimum. Temperature matters. But when we look at our clippings at the OJ NOR, this is the actual amount of clippings that we get. And again, you can ignore the units, 0 to 6 here, versus what the pace growth potential model predicted. This is what the graph looks like. So it's pretty ugly. Overall, what's the average clippings that we get? It looks like about 1.2. And then what's the average of the growth potential on this side? 1.2. So, I mean, it gets the annual average pretty good, but it's not going to give you on a day-to-day basis. It's not going to predict your growth. So I love the superintendents that are out there using growth potential to determine their nitrogen requirements. But I think it's a mistake to do that on a weekly or even monthly basis. It's probably better just to look at it annually. So we think we can build a weekly or monthly model. I'll talk to you about that in a second. But basically, traffic and nitrogen have pretty similar impacts on clippings. So let's say 1.2, which is about our average, is our optimum. Let's say we want to keep our clippings around 1.2 for maximum performance. Under high traffic, we would need 0.4 pounds of nitrogen every other week to get to that level. Okay, so that's a lot of nitrogen, and the high traffic that we used in this scenario was way too much traffic. We made a mistake in estimating the amount of traffic, and we ended up doing that. Low traffic would be a pretty high level of traffic for the real world. But if you put 0.4 pounds of nitrogen down every other week, you're way above that 1.2 target. You're growing too much grass. It looks like 0.2 pounds every other week is about right. And based on my experience and knowledge, 0.2 of a pound every other week for a high traffic golf course in Wisconsin is about right. If you're putting down no nitrogen, your clipping level is too low. Now, if you're under no traffic, which is my typical research plots, we don't need any nitrogen to hit those growth targets. If we put down 0.2, 0.4, we're growing more grass than we need to. So again, why do things like we used to do with growth regulators? Well, it says apply every 4 weeks or every 6 to 8 weeks on the label, so that's what we're going to do. We go out every other Monday with our nitrogen at 0.2. You know, I know you don't do that. I know that you're adjusting things on a basis, but you probably should be having a target to determine whether or not those adjustments make sense. Now, I said everything affects growth, but nothing affects growth real strongly. So this is Chiu's data on how clippings are affected by soil moisture content. You got these 3 blobs. She was basically managing turf at about 10, 20, and 30% soil moisture. And you can see that, yeah, the 30 ones was growing higher, but there's a lot of variability, and it's not a real strong relationship. Similarly, with traffic, when we look at it, 0 rounds per week versus 2,000 rounds per week. Yeah, sure, the growth goes down, but it's not real super strong relationship. So this is kind of disappointing because it means that building a model would be tough. But the good news is artificial intelligence and machine learning is all the rage right now. And that's what this stuff is built to do, is to take these really crappy relationships, throw them in the computer, and spit out something that works, that I can't even comprehend or even explain to you why it works, but the computer figures it out. And the computer tells us, you know, we throw in all the weather data, all the nitrogen management data, the rounds per week, the type of root zone it was, the numbers of days growth the grass had on it, all that stuff we throw into the computer, and it tells us which ones were the most important for making the model that the computer makes. And so these are 2 different versions, but look at what the most important stuff is for determining bentgrass growth: relative humidity, maximum of the 3 previous days, relative humidity average over 5 days, 3 days average temperature, 4-day average temperature, relative humidity previous 4 days minimum. So the first 5 things that this model said was important for bentgrass growth were relative humidity and temperature. Okay, that's the stuff in the Smith-Kearns dollar spot model. Nitrogen doesn't show up till the middle. All right, I would have thought that would have been the top. It's the middle thing. It's the 6th thing. NDRE, that's a nitrogen factor. NDRE, nitrogen factor. Wind, ET, traffic down here at the bottom. So it matters, but not a ton. So weather, nitrogen, traffic. And over here, you have a root zone in here, organic matter. Nitrogen rate's a little bit higher in this one. So every time the computer runs a model, it turns out a little bit different. But you can learn something from that. So here's our model. This is what the computer spits out, which is super impressive to me. Again, our scale goes from 0 to 6 in clippings, 0 to 6. This is our actual clippings, and then this is what the computer predicted. And so when the computer predicts 1, we're getting about 1. When the computer predicts 4, we're getting about 4. So it works really, really good. So we're excited about that. We haven't. It takes a lot of computer programming to be able to release this so you can use it. So we're not quite there yet, but it's pretty sweet. So we're hoping people can start managing their nitrogen using models that are a little bit more representative of reality. It is custom. The model we're making is customizable. This is everything we throw at the computer on the left. We can take out, maybe you don't measure NDRE. Or even know what the hell that is, which is fine. Soil moisture content, maybe you don't want to input that into the model every day. And so then when you take those two things out, you still get pretty good predictions, but it drops down a bit. And then the one on the right is, let's say you just want to hook your weather station up to this thing because relative humidity and temperature were so important. Still not bad. You know, you can see the points start to spread and scatter a bit, but it's a heck of a lot better than just using the temperature that is in the PACE turf growth model. So we're excited about this. Let's Frank, it looks like you want to say something. Or maybe, no, he's just frozen up on my screen. Okay.
Hey, Doug.
All right, I can hear you. Carl, I think we're losing him. Bad internet?
Yeah, he said he's got a bad connection, so maybe we'll keep rolling and
okay.
See if we can figure it out later.
Okay, so nitrogen cycle. Another thing that we teach in all our introductory classes, and the way we teach this thing is we say, hey, this is really complicated, and it's really hard to predict nitrogen by looking at these different components. Turns out for putting greens though, sand-based putting greens, the nitrogen cycle is dead simple. And I'm going to show you. So this is actually a nitrogen cycle diagram I stole from Crops and Soils over at Cornell, as it shows the blue things are nitrogen coming into the system, the red things are nitrogen leaving the system, and the green things are just where the nitrogen lives. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just kind of take away all the ways that nitrogen is lost that don't matter to us. So in turf, we don't care about runoff and erosion. We don't get those things. We don't care about denitrification. Doesn't really happen in a sand-based green. Our research data and from years and years of testing know that leaching is not that important, and then volatilization just doesn't happen in a sand-based root zone. So we can go click, 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 click. That means the only nitrogen loss that you have to think about is your crop harvest. That's your clipping removal. Same thing with inputs. We don't get atmospheric deposition is really small and it's constant. You can predict it just by looking on a map. But animal manures and biosolids, no. Biological fixation by legumes, soybeans, clover, no. Plant residues, no, because you're removing it. So we can get rid of all that stuff, and the only input to your system is commercial fertilizer. So you got one input, you got one output. Your fertilizer, you know how much you put down. Your crop harvest, you have no idea, right? So all you have to do is figure out your crop harvest to figure out if these two things are in balance. That's what you're shooting for. And then the pools are here. The organic nitrogen is the only pool that we really care about. And if your fertilization, if your blue box is bigger than your red box, your organic matter is going to increase. If your fertilization is lower than your harvest, which is absolutely possible, your organic matter goes down. We care a heck of a lot about soil organic matter. It's something that we measure. It's something that we manage. So this balance between your fertilization and your crop harvest influences it. I can't think of a better reason for you to start measuring your crop harvest. Okay, so another way to say this is basically you want your nitrogen additions to equal your removal or loss to keep your organic matter stable. If you screw that up, if you add too much nitrogen, you're going to build soil organic matter, you're going to have maybe thatch issues, and you can start to run into leaching problems if you overdo it. If you don't put down enough, which is probably the case, that we're probably closer to this deficit issue than on the surplus on average, you're slowly depleting your organic matter. You're going to see a steady decline in turf grass quality over years or decades, and eventually you're just not going to have enough organic matter to have a healthy stand. We showed this back with Bill Kreuser's work, back at 10 years ago now, at least, where he put down different rates of primo and different rates of nitrogen, and he kind of measured. Like I said, I've been collecting clippings for this purpose for years. It's just really labor intensive the way I do it. And we basically found that same thing. Hey, if you're using Primo to reduce your growth, you can back off on your nitrogen by a pretty decent amount, because clipping removal is the way that nitrogen gets lost. If you're removing less clippings because your growth regulators are down, you can put less down and to keep that balance there. So to illustrate this, we got visual turfgrass quality of 7.5. We can hit that if we don't use Primo. We need to put down just under 0.3 of a pound every other week to hit that target. But what we found is if we use Primo, we're hitting a turfgrass quality rating of 7.5 at 0.2 of a pound. And so when you reduce growth, it's basically doing the same thing as increasing your nitrogen fertilization. So those things go hand in hand. The exact same data, just plotted in a different way. So now on the y-axis, we have the amount of fertilizer applied minus the amount of nitrogen removed in clippings. And like I said, your goal is probably to break even, to be at around 0. And with Primo, our break even point was at about 0.2 of a pound, and without Primo is at about 0.3 of a pound. So again, your amount of growth can guide the amount of fertilization that you want to shoot for. All right, so a photo here from Michael Woods, who's been talking about clipping volume collection for a long time, and largely because he was aware of people in Japan doing it and monitoring their growth and finding that that's a really useful thing to do. So I don't think we have really fine-tuned the optimum growth rates. So knowing exactly what to do with that number in terms of your your quality and performance. But we absolutely can tell you how much nitrogen you're removing, and it can inform your nitrogen program. So, if you're on Twitter, people are doing this and they're loving it. I love this slide from Chris Trittabaugh, who's one of the pioneers of doing this and talking about it. And so this slide he made is about what he says when people say why they don't do it. Along with this nice shot from Sue Crawford here. So why not? I don't know where to find a bucket. Okay. It takes too long, and this is something that I now know is one of the simplest things you do. It takes less than 1 minute per green. It's easier than doing soil moisture. You don't need a $1,200 meter to do this thing. It's not accurate enough, but there's nothing that doesn't make sense at all, because what you're doing now is even less accurate than this. So of course it's not perfectly accurate, but it's a heck of a lot better than looking in the back of the buckets. It's hard to keep track of all the data. Okay, so I'm going to address that. That's the first good point we've seen. And then this one, I can tell by looking in the baskets. Yeah, right. Just like you could tell what the soil moisture was by feeling it in your hands, right? Of course you can. Of course you can get a feel for it, but your soil moisture meter is better at telling you when your greens need to be watered than feeling around in the moisture. I don't meet any superintendents these days who say I'm better at it than the moisture meter, right? Of course you used to do that by looking in the soil and feeling the soil, but the moisture meter makes you better. This makes you better at than looking in the baskets. And Dave Hicks and Carl Scamenti have this awesome podcast where they're talking about how collecting clipping volume helped dial in just getting the mower set up right. So this is one thing that I think is worth remembering is that humans are really bad observers, and data always helps us make better decisions. So why you're in Cornell's in wine country. And that's where I first got my experience with tasting notes on wine. And red wines have these things like raspberry and tobacco and wood and things like that. And the white wines are floral and honey and all that, right? So they gave the exact same white wine to a bunch of wine drinkers, and to one of them they added the red dye, completely tasteless, completely odorless, just made the wine red. And then they asked that person to tell them, give us your tasting notes. When the wine was red, they used descriptors associated with red wines, the tobacco and the cherry and the prune and the licorice. And then when they gave them the white wine, they used the white wine words, right? And that's what this scatter plot is showing us, is nobody was telling, when that wine was colored red, nobody was saying, hey, this is a white wine that's red. Okay, because your eyes tell you what it should taste like. this comic here talking about a knee surgery. We'll just mill around until he's asleep and send him back up. This operation is just for placebo. This is a real thing. 180 patients who had knee surgery randomly assigned to 3 groups: the traditional one, an experimental surgery, and then a sham surgery where they just cut the knee open and then sewed it back up. Results were stunning. Those who had the actual procedures did no better than those who had the sham surgery. But it wasn't because the surgeries didn't work. It's because the people that had the sham surgery got better. Okay, because they thought they had a knee surgery. And so they came back and said, yeah, my knee's better. Thanks for cutting it open and sewing it back up, right? So are they better? I guess they are, because they think they're better. Weightlifting study. These weightlifters entered 11-week study. The first 7 weeks was just a weed out thing. So like, the best of the best here are going to be entered into the second phase where we're going to give you steroids. So these people were competing to remain in the study, right? They're trying really hard. Then the people that made the cut, who did the best, were given steroids, and look what happened. Before the pills, the average person was added 6 pounds to their squat when they're trying to stay in the study. After they're given the steroid, they added 42 pounds to their squat. Same thing with the bench press: 10 pounds before the pills, 30 pounds after the pills. Guess what? There were no steroids. There was sugar pill, right? So these people who were trying their hardest, you give them a sugar pill and they think it's a steroid, and magically they lift more weight. Okay. I mean, humans are really not logical. We're messed up. Our brain controls what we do, what we feel, how we heal a lot. And you as a turfgrass manager are absolutely susceptible to that same stuff. The Onion does a take on this, right? If the Onion does it, it's real. Or it's part of our society. So Viagra announces the real medicine that gave customers erection was confidence all along. And I promise you that there are actual data on this. You give somebody a blue pill and you know what's going to happen, even if it's a blue sugar pill. All right. So there's a lot of it. So surely it works and it changes your physiology, but a lot of that stuff is in your head. This gray bar in the middle of this, the shaded area, is the same color, but to me, it looks lighter on the left and darker on the right, but that's because my brain is telling me that because it's influenced by what's surrounding it. So when I click off the border, yeah, now I can see it's all the same color, but my brain will not tell me that that's the same color gray bar when I'm looking at it here. Okay. So golf course superintendents are the best observers of all the turf managers I work with. Golf course superintendents are the best. But you're still not that good because you're a human, right? So the more data you have, the better you're going to be. And how I know that you're not that good at observing is because through my conversations with you on Primo. When people tell me, yeah, I put this stuff down, just shuts it down, shuts that growth down. It's incredible the difference. I go from baling hay to no clippings in the bucket. And I just know it's not true because I've been collecting growth from Primo on greens for 14 years, and you can't tell. You can't tell by looking. You can barely tell sometimes by doing it real carefully. So this is what Primo treated versus non-treated control looks like. This is actual data from 2008. It's pretty messy. There ain't any shutting it down in here, okay? Sometimes you can see it on fairways. So, I can show you situations where you would see it with your eyes, but on greens, no way. Okay, so the reason you saw it shut down was because you put down that product and you're experiencing a placebo effect. You expected it to be shut down. So this big drop off here, let's say we made the application here in early August 8th, and then the weather basically shut down the grass growth for whatever reason, because relative humidity and temperature plays such a big role, and you attribute that to the Primo. Okay, so and there's no question in your mind that because you applied the Primo, that huge decrease in clippings wouldn't have happened without it. Okay, so this is what research data gives you the ability to do. Put out your test plots. You are not immune to this. No matter how good of a careful observer you are, without data, you're powerless. And I don't want to say like I'm on my high horse here and I'm a great observer and you're not. I'm terrible too. I was in New Jersey giving a talk to the Aquatrolls group long time ago. I was sleeping in the bed in the hotel room, and I couldn't fall asleep because it felt too cold. And then like as soon as I was kind of thinking, do I get up and change the temperature, or just fall asleep and quit thinking about it? So I decided to get up middle of the night, turn the dial up on the wall, went back to sleep, slept like a baby immediately. And then I woke up in the morning, and that thermostat had a sign on it that said, if you want to adjust the temperature, go over to the unit under the window because this thing doesn't work, right? And that right there, I'm like, God, that placebo effect is so strong. If you spend a whole bunch of money on a product, it has already worked the second you pay that invoice, because you're committed to it mentally. It already worked. So just don't forget that. And the solution to all this is collecting data. Our moisture, our moisture probes have changed the way that we collect and manage our moisture. I used to have to set up my studies to have high irrigation distribution uniformity. And now I don't care about distribution uniformity. I care about having even distribution of moisture in the soil. And so, like in this case here, we were doing a wetting agent study. They tell us in the contract your DU has to be 80%, meaning the water has to be applied evenly, or we're not going to give you the money. Well, when I apply the water evenly, I get a wet corner and I get a dry corner. If I turn off this head here in the wet corner, my distribution uniformity goes down to 12%, but I got a whole lot of uniformity in my soil moisture content here. So that the data revolution in moisture has improved your management. So it's time to let the clipping collection be the next thing. Again, same. This is the OJ. This is data from 3 of my putting greens at the OJ North Center, experiencing the same temperature, right? So they're all bent grass. This is the amount of nitrogen removed in the clippings at different points in the year from these 3 greens. So you can see they look totally different. And you might start managing your greens a little bit differently, because you're noticing that one green you're removing a ton of nitrogen from for some reason. It's growing a lot higher rate, and that this other green is really low for whatever reason. So you're going to start to pick up on those things, and you're going to become a better manager, because you're going to notice that not everything is uniform and the same. Just like you don't water all your greens exactly the same, you probably shouldn't be putting down nitrogen on all your greens exactly the same. Okay, so this is the kind of the revolution that that makes clipping collection possible and easy for you, is that basically the dry weight, which is what I've been recording and Dr. Kreuzer has been recording for years laboriously, is really well correlated with clipping volume. So you just got to throw it in a bucket and say how many liters or gallons or quarts are in that bucket. R square here is 0.67. That's pretty darn good. Like I said, not perfect, but it's good. Micah, myself, and Bill Kreuzer compared data a couple years ago, and we're like, oh crap, my numbers are way different than yours. Bill's, his relationship here was 0.42. I was 0.6, or Micah was 0.6. I was up here at 0.8. Turns out this is just how we compact them. So we asked Bill, how do you do it? I don't compact them at all. I just throw them in the bucket. If you do it that way, this is your relationship. I asked my grad student, Chiu Zhou, hey, how are you getting those conversions? Well, she's like, I put it in the bucket and I compact it until it doesn't compact anymore, until the clippings don't go down. Well, then if you're doing it that way, you need to use this conversion. And then we asked Micah how you do it, and he says, well, I just give it 2 taps, somewhere in the middle, and that's where his data falls out. So you do have to pay attention to how you're packing your clippings. The spreadsheet I'm going to show you in a second uses the Woods conversion. So throw it in the bucket and give it 2 firm taps. Allow those, the big air gaps to settle out, but don't spend all your time compacting and pressing like we've done. But definitely do more than just throw it in the bucket like Bill did for this demonstration. One of my former students, Alex Biesenkrohn, who's now the superintendent at Blue Mountain Country Club in Wisconsin, was the assistant, or one of the assistants at Erin Hills. And I said, Alex, do me a favor, collect clippings for me for this year and tell me what you think. And he loved it, and they're still doing it. So he says it's simple. basically general staff bought into it and they liked it because you're giving those staff members a task, and you're asking them to contribute to the higher level stuff. So they say things like, hey, you might want to look at number 12. It's the second day in a row we haven't gotten much. So they're paying more attention. They're not just out there mowing lines. They're actually looking at their data. This is the biggest one in my opinion. Basically, it allows you to do quality control on your mowers. You could compare why mowers 1 and 3 are getting less than mowers 5 and 7. So it gives you some feedback to give to your mechanic. If you got a triplex, you can look at the individual clippings from each of the 3 reels, and you might realize that even though they're set exactly the same, you're getting different amounts of clippings, and you can adjust your mower setup to get uniform mowing. Then Alex is talking about, it's wonderful to know how that the nitrogen and the growth regulators are affecting growth. Again, if you're under your growth target, why are you putting down a growth regulator? If you're way above your growth target, why are you putting down nitrogen? And so things like that. So again, it's simple. I encourage you to do this if you're not. This is the worst part about it is the data collection. There's a handful of the people that are doing it now are comfortable with this, and like this is one of Chris Tridabaw's old spreadsheets. I think he's updated it since, but showing how he's recording ball roll speed and all kinds of stuff on a spreadsheet he made himself. But I'm going to encourage you to use my spreadsheet if you're not a data person. I'm going to just go and show you where to get it. turf.wisc.edu is our turf program's website here, and then we have a section called tools, and the first tool is the Wisconsin clipping tracker template. You click on that and it just downloads an Excel spreadsheet, and this is what this thing looks like. Hello, you gonna open for me today? Okay, I'm gonna give that a second. Where's my presentation here? So basically, when that opens up, whenever it's ready, you just enter your clipping vault. You got to tell me how big your greens are. So you got to enter the size of your greens, and then you just enter the number of liters you get from each green. You can do it for one hole. You can do it for all 18. Or however many holes you have, and then it'll automatically graph up your clipping volume in liters per 100 square meters, so you can see where things are at. And then the thing that I like the most about it is this: it tells you how much nitrogen you've removed. So here and this is data from Aaron Hills from a few years ago. They're removing 2 pounds of clippings during their season. Okay, so that should inform how much nitrogen they want to put down. You probably want to be around 2 pounds if you want to keep your organic matter steady. Let's see if I can see if that thing opened. Yeah, here it is. So how to use this. Step 1, enter your information on your 1,000 square feet of your areas. And we got custom areas if you got practice putting greens or whatever. And then we have the whole numbers, 1 through 18 in this case. The volume to weight conversion, that's the thing I was talking about with how you compact your clippings, and you can adjust it. Right now, the default is set up to the Michael Woods way. And then percent tissue nitrogen, we assume is 4%. If you do have data, you can change that to 5. Maybe it's 3.8, whatever it is, and that's gonna adjust the amount of nitrogen you remove. But it's set to 4, which is a good average if you don't have data. You enter your clipping data here, depending on the day, and then you get your clipping volume chart. I don't have any data in here. And then I'll tell you your estimated removal. And then this is where all the calculations happen. So just stay away from the calculations page. So it's so easy that there's no excuse not to do it because you don't want to do the data analysis. So I've sent this tracker out to a bunch of people that I work with here in the Midwest and asked them some questions about their property. And the average person is getting about 2 liters per 100 square meter. Micah is now talking about this in milliliters per square meter. It's just liters per 100 square meter times 10. So but anyway, that's about 2, right? And from that, the estimated nitrogen removal is only 1.1 pounds, which has surprised me. I thought I would see higher numbers than that. But that's what the data are saying. Again, this is only from about 10 courses in the upper Midwest. The emerging guidelines from golf course superintendents who are doing this they're saying 1 liter per 1,000 or 100 square meter is good for tournament conditions, but it's probably not sustainable. 2 liters is a good target for daily average. Interesting that that's exactly how it turned out for these 10 courses. And then when you start to get into 4 liters per 100 square meter, we're talking excessive. Now, these guidelines are probably about as useful as me telling you in the morning you want to have your soil moisture around 20 to 22%, and your greens are going to wilt when they get down around 9 or 10%. Okay, nobody's going to drastically disagree with that, but you might say, oh, my number's 17 in the morning, or my number's 25 in the morning. So these are ballpark, but when you start to collect your clippings, you're going to figure out what you like. Maybe you can survive down here at 1.5 liters per 100 square meter, or closer to 1 for a better part of the year for whatever reason. Maybe you got to be above 2. I don't know, but it's going to be somewhere in that ballpark. So wrapping up here. Turfgrass fertilization it's headed to the Liebig's law of the minimum, where soil testing is going to stop driving our fertilizer inputs. I'm always I'm bothered by the data that GCSAA found, where people that soil test apply a lot more nutrients than people that don't. And I don't think what they're saying is that people that soil test have a lot worse turf than people that don't. So when you're soil testing, you get all those interpretations that are based on super conservative targets. You end up throwing down fertilizer, chasing targets that aren't real. It feels good to hit targets, but it's not a real thing. So stop relying on soil testing. That's a whole nother talk for me, but keep it simple. Focus on your nitrogen management. That's what your plant needs. That's what's driving growth. That's what matters. Use clipping volume to determine your fertilization, not your soil test report. You're going to figure out your growth targets. We're going to continue refining them. We're going to build that model that's going to, if you don't want to collect clippings or you skip it for a couple weeks for whatever reason, our model will fill in the gaps. And you're going to start using your nitrogen and your PGRs more in tandem rather than, in opposition rather than in tandem, I should say, to hit your growth targets. I know people are already doing this. We don't, the turfgrass scientist community, we don't do anything in a vacuum, right? All this stuff is based on conversations with you. We're trying to refine the management that you're doing by using data. So, anything I've said today, please don't take offense that I don't think you don't know this stuff conceptually. I'm just trying to give you the tools and the background data to use it better. Just another really nice slide here from Chris Trittabaugh showing how he's thinking about how nitrogen management's going to change. Instead of, I said, don't fertilize all 18 greens the same, you can take that another step further and don't even fertilize putting green number 5 all the same. And so here he's got that split up. This is how you water, right? You water your driest spot. You water your entire green to the amount that the wettest spot needs. And then you start hand watering the ones that need more, right? That's the best way to water a green that has a wide gradient in moisture. You should probably be thinking about doing that for nitrogen too. You got this low area in the back that doesn't get a lot of traffic, doesn't need a lot of nitrogen. You got this front area here that needs 2 times as much nitrogen as that back area, okay? So this is you should probably be thinking about your nitrogen management almost exactly how you think about your water management, in terms of you're doing it based on data and you need different amounts in every way. So I did this talk up in northern Wisconsin last year, the year before, and one of the distributor reps came up to me afterwards, he former superintendent, his dad was a superintendent, 2nd generation up in northern Wisconsin, and he said, that was great. And he's like, you know what though? That last slide you showed about the clipping, how we're fertilizing the greens. That's how my dad would do it in the 60s. We'd go out, we'd have maps, and we'd fertilize these areas twice. So again, I know people have been, this isn't like revolutionary stuff, but hopefully it gets you thinking about how to change your management, or to hit growth targets, rather than just doing things on the calendar. Okay, Chris Richter invited me to give this presentation, and I'm immensely disappointed we didn't get to do it in person, up in Rochester for the inaugural event there. I was scheduled to give 2 talks, so that was basically one of them, and then this is one slide on my second talk. And I always, you should always be able to sum up a 50-minute presentation in one slide. You never know you need it. So here it is. We've been doing a lot of work with iron. I got all kinds of things to say about iron, but iron sulfate, 6 ounces per 1,000 every 7 days. Spray volume doesn't matter, but 1.5 gallons in this picture is pretty darn good dollar spot control. So this is the non-treated in 2017 versus that program on the right. Here's the same program in 2018 under higher pressure. If you start deviating from this, if you go lower than 6 ounces, if you go less frequently in 7 days, it ain't gonna work. So yes, dollar spot or iron sulfate can be an amazing dollar spot control, but you got to put down a lot of it, and it's got to be pretty frequent. So we're working on, with Paul Koch and the Smith-Kearns dollar spot model stuff, and seeing if we can target windows where you can go out and do this program intensively for 4 or 5 weeks, and then when dollar spot's not in season, you can probably back off on it a bit. But pretty cool tool here to minimize the use of fungicides, especially on fairways, for cost reasons and maybe for environmental reasons as well. So that's my iron update in a nutshell. And guys, I think that's all I have. Be happy to open it up for chat and for questions.
So can you guys hear me, or is my connection not good?
We can hear you.
Okay, Doug, let me ask you about Alex at Blue Mound. The 5th point on that slide said he didn't fertilize from May to July with nitrogen using this clipping collection method. Can you chat about that for a second? You want to pull that slide back up and maybe just chat about that point, because, that's really ground truing. That's sort of testing out traffic and otherwise. Now, I don't know what traffic at Blue Mound is like. That's one of the great, beautiful golf courses in Wisconsin. I don't know how busy.
No, well, this was Aaron Hill's data.
No. Back to Alex's 5th point.
Yeah. But I mean, that was relative to Aaron Hill's. So
this one.
Yep. Right. So
this was Aaron Hill's, not at Blue Mound.
Right. So he says, we went from May to July without any nitrogen, and that's the longest stretch we've gone. Let's go look at his graph here. This is the Aaron Hill's removal.
I thought it was 2 different data sets.
He was removing nitrogen. Even though he wasn't fertilizing, he was removing it. Why? Like I said in the beginning, most of your nitrogen comes from your soil. So the soil was giving that grass enough growth to hit his growth target, where he is saying, don't add it. That's how you use it, and that's how simple it is. So, I mean, literally give you the spreadsheet one time and you're making adjustments like that. Now
okay, I know from visiting and the life we've been living, it's been raining for the last couple of years, Doug. And so we observed this on our Cornell golf course. Right after a rain, the lag would result in a big spike of uncontrolled growth, even under growth regulators. So is this about the amount of moisture in that system as well?
Yeah, I think so. And that's what we're seeing with Chiu's data too, is that when you're keeping it as dry as you're keeping it, you're handcuffing those soil microbes. They can't break that organic matter down like they like to. So when it gets a spike, they're happy, right? And so we're seeing that soil moisture plays a big role in growth. And I've seen your data, and that's more evidence. And if you look here at these spikes here, this is the average clipping volume, and the dots are individual days. It's spiky. That's why I'm saying, like, Primo reduces your growth rate 20%. Your growth on a day-to-day basis fluctuates by a factor of 5 times, right? You can't tell a growth regulator 20% when things are bouncing around by a factor of 5, and it's because of those flushes of growth you get from the rainfall and stuff, the relative humidity and things like that.
All right, listen, since you're on this Excel page, I want to draw your attention to the percent nitrogen in the tissue. This is always this reverberating question, the value of tissue nitrogen concentration. You put it in there as a factor of how you adjust maybe how much N you're taking off or finding. And that might be something, I know that there are firms that do this, that you send them your clippings and they'll analyze them for you on a regular basis. Can you talk a little bit about knowing this number? Is it important, and how much will it influence the way you wind up fertilizing?
Yeah, it's not, it doesn't fluctuate a lot, which is why clipping volume alone is good. A good average is 4%. It's certainly not going to be 4% every time you test. So Chris Trittlebaugh at Hazeltine said, based on our average testing, we're actually at 4.8. Good, use 4.8. But it's not something that you need to track right along with the clippings all the time. So if you got, you know what, the way I like to see tissue testing is 3 times a year, spring, summer, fall. Keep it simple. It gives you your potassium numbers at a time where it makes sense. Take those nitrogen numbers too, average them together and throw them in this box right here. It's going to be close to 4, but you know, and that could be when I said, you know, I was surprised to see how low the nitrogen removal was from the Midwest superintendents. You know, by bumping the clippings, the percent tissue nitrogen to 4 to 5 is going to increase that 20%. And so it could be, it's going to move your target around a little bit, but it's not going to change a lot of stuff.
Okay. How about other questions for Doug, Carl?
Yeah, so Greg was asking a question relating to frequent small amounts of nitrogen versus maybe 2 or 3 times a year slow release. Can you talk, Doug, about how that may change your growth rate and if that provides more or less fluctuation?
Yeah, I mean, on greens, this is all green stuff, really. You know, we haven't talked much about fairway fertilization where you might employ a slow release fertilizer, but I wouldn't use slow release fertilizers on greens. It doesn't make sense. You're out there too many times. You should have a tighter, and I don't care what your budget is, you should have tighter control over your nitrogen with a soluble source. So that's my view on that. You know, maybe a few exceptions for after you put it to bed. The slow release nitrogen is going to get mowed off mostly, and the liquid slow releases I don't love. So if you're talking fairways, though, yeah, you know, the target, the growth targets are probably less critical. But you can probably get by with spoon feeding your fairways too, depending on your number of applications. Urea is super soluble. You can put down 1/4 of a pound at least, maybe up to 0.4 pounds at a single time without burning. So, you know, you got to have a real good reason to pay for a slow release fertilizer in my mind.
Okay, so this is a very interesting question, Doug, because as we confront, you know, the correction that's going to happen in golf, one of the things that's going to get looked at is large scale nutrient applications to fairways and immediate rough. And we've got a lot of high end golf like everywhere else that's used to it being a certain way. Are you suggesting that, you know, a lot of guys will just do that? They'll just put a granular out. It might make sense from a labor perspective. I know there's been studies, even you've done them, right? Looking at urea versus UMax, not a huge difference. How much am I really getting by having more slow release in a fairway product from a labor savings versus the nitrogen that pulses the plants need? It's also generally a native soil out there, not sand.
Yeah, right. More organic matter. You need less. So in my experience around here in Wisconsin, people are applying between 1 and maybe 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet on their fairways. So what I would do if you fall into that ballpark is go look at how many times you spray a fairway and divide your annual nitrogen rate by the number of times you spray. And if that number comes down to a reasonable amount of a quick release fertilizer like urea, then you can really inexpensively fertilize your fairways by just adding some nitrogen to the tank each time, and you can totally forego a slow release source. And it also gives you more control over when that stuff is releasing. So, not to say that granulars don't make sense, like you said, from a labor standpoint. I see a lot of people going down with a 2-pound application of a polymer coated urea, and we're done with it, for the whole year, and that certainly is great. Like I said, it's just the fairways aren't as critical as the greens. You don't. Most people aren't hand watering their fairways and mapping the moisture in your fairways. So just think about exactly like moisture. Put the amount of effort into your greens, same way you put your moisture. Put the same amount of nitrogen thought into how you're watering your fairways. There's just more room for air.
We're at the witching hour, Carl. Other questions?
Yeah, one more question from Dave, and this is so Dave Hicks, the superintendent of the Cornell University golf course that we worked with a little bit on this clipping volume research. And so actually one time last year, Dave was doing a verticutting and actually blew off all the material and collected that. And we found that was a lot of material and was almost, in terms of volume, worth about a month of growth just from mowing. Doug, do you have any comments on if you've looked at vertical mowing or core cultivation, the other removal methods of plant tissue, and how that factors into how much nitrogen you're removing from the plant?
Yeah, if you added up all that stuff, your soil organic matter and all that, you got 20 pounds of nitrogen in the soil, right? So if you just let that stuff, if you don't fertilize, you can survive a long time as that stuff slowly breaks down. And that's exactly it. You're removing it because there's too much there, and you don't want to replace that, certainly. So just think about the inputs, the outputs, right? You got too much thatch, you want to remove that. You want to get that out of the system. And it's all linked to nitrogen. So I'm not saying that you got to replace everything you remove. It just gets you to think about why you should be doing it, is because it is a balance. It's where did that stuff come from? It came from nitrogen being put down, and that's where it went. And maybe that's too much.
All right,
Yeah, that
Carl.
was
Yeah. Do you want to thank Doug and do the sponsors, or is there another question?
so I did want to ask another question, Doug.
Let's do it.
So we talk about, we're kind of focusing the conversation on top growth, and I know a lot of people will ask me about, well, is when I make a fertilizer application, what if I'm using Primo and I'm getting more root growth and shoot growth? Is that kind of a one-to-one relationship? Whenever I apply fertilizer, I'm going to get the same amount of top growth versus the same amount of bottom growth? Do I have to worry about when I'm applying during the year? Is that going to differ? Is that a consideration people should have?
Yeah, that's you hear that a lot about, like, I'm doing this for the roots, right? And it's like that's what you say when you don't want to listen to what I'm trying to say. It's like the we're not doing anything on the roots. They're hard to measure. They're hard for us to quantify. Of course they matter, but if you're taking care of the top, the bottoms are going to follow. And I've not seen what you're saying, like a lot of big differences that we're saying, oh yeah, it's showing up in the roots, but it's not showing up in the top growth. So I can't really speak to your question, but that's my perspective on it.
Well, and just to validate that a little bit more, you can see 10, 15-year-old putting greens that Danelli had for years. The roots went down 4 inches and stopped. If they were going to keep growing, where do they go after they go to the bottom of the cup in the first year, Doug? I mean, they die back and they sort of work in a particular volume, and they seem to not go much deeper than that, but they do create a mass at top. I'd like to take you down the road of, roots. If you're fertilizing for roots, you could be creating problems that you have to then dilute.
Yeah. So, and I'll put in a shameless plug here. Join us at 2 Central for a Greenkeeper discussion. We got Raku Swa coming up. We're going to talk about organic matter. But what I think you should be doing is tracking your organic matter by, Micah Woods says every 2 centimeters. I'd say every inch. Something like that. Go down where your roots are. You got 4 inches. Chop them up into little bits and think about that as that's where your nitrogen's going, and that's where your organic matter is. And you manage organic matter, but your sampling methods are probably, if you're doing 3 or 4 inches, that's not high enough resolution. But yeah, growing roots builds organic matter, and that's something we're trying to minimize.
And so a plug for the Greenkeeper one more time, Doug.
Yeah, 2 p.m. Central. You can go to greenkeeperapp.com to find the link. And we'll have an hour discussion with Rock Gussois, myself, Bill Kreuzer, and any participants that want to join.
That sounds like a blast.
Yeah.
All right, Doug, thanks for joining us. Carl, take us home.
Yep. Just one more time, we wanted to thank our sponsors. For everyone, I did put the GCSA education code in the chat box a while back. So if you didn't get that before we started, you can go look for that. So again, thanks to the sponsors that are helping putting us on. Andre and Son, First Turf and Ornamental, Harrell's, Grassland, our platinum sponsors, our gold sponsors, Finch Turf, BASF, MTE, Pump Irrigation Tech. And then our silver sponsors, Syngenta, Ewing, Turf and Soil, Nutrient Solutions, Weber Golf and Turf, and DryJet.
Be sure to tune in next week and watch me try to tee it up for a golf course architect with Ian Andrews. That's going to be a sight to see.
That's right. Next week's discussion is Ian Andrew. He's going to have some stuff on minimal golf course design, so that should be a good time. So with that, everybody, thanks for joining today. You can see us next week, same time, same place, for the third week in our GCSAA NY Golf Symposium series.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Doug. See you guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.